What if everything you were told was perfectly packaged? What if the outrage, the silence, the perfectly timed statements weren't accidents, but part of the show? Tonight, we're entering a fictional storm so loud it allegedly has phones buzzing, meetings happening behind closed doors, and no comment statements working overtime. According to this dramatized narrative, tensions explode after a viral commentator character named Candace drops what she calls the truth, and suddenly, a fictional public figure named Tenisha is, well, not amused. Now pause. Ask yourself, why does every story have a script? Why does transparency always arrive pre-filtered? And why does the word move on usually show up right before uncomfortable questions? In this satirical universe, whispers turn into headlines, insiders become anonymous, and outrage conveniently redirects attention elsewhere. Coincidence? Or just excellent PR? Grab your popcorn because in this parody, nothing is proven, everything is questioned. And the loudest reactions often come from those claiming there's nothing to hide. Let's talk about the fictional version of the cover-up. In this fictional narrative, everything begins the same way most modern controversies do. Not with evidence, not with facts, but with questions that refuse to stay quiet. Questions that people are told are inappropriate, insensitive, or simply not helpful right now. And in this dramatized universe, that's exactly what makes them impossible to ignore. Because silence, especially coordinated silence, has a sound of its own, according to this satirical storyline. The moment Candace Owens, portrayed here as an outspoken commentator character, began publicly questioning inconsistencies surrounding the death of Malcolm-Jamal Warner, things shifted behind the scenes. Not publicly, of course. Publicly, everything looked polished. Statements were carefully worded. Faces were calm. The messaging was unified. But privately, at least according to this fictional retelling, tension started leaking through the cracks. The core of the controversy in this narrative isn't a single accusation. It's a pattern, a sequence of moments that don't quite line up the way audiences expect them to. Statements that answer questions nobody asked, while the real questions hang in the air unanswered. And in this dramatized version of events, Candace keeps pointing that out. Not claiming guilt, not naming criminals, just circling the same uncomfortable thought again and again. Why does this story feel so managed? Enter Tenisha Warner, depicted here as a central figure not because of proven wrongdoing, but because of perception. In this fictional framework, she becomes the face of moving forward, of urging unity, stability, and protection of legacy. And that's where the clash begins. Because to some fictional observers, advocating for calm looks suspiciously like controlling the narrative. Again, not illegal, not even immoral on its face, but politically, socially, emotionally strategic. This is where the dramatized tension escalates. Candace, in this storyline, doesn't accuse. She questions tone. She questions timing. She questions why calls for transparency are met not with clarity, but with exhaustion. Why is everyone being told the discussion is over when it never really started? In our satirical universe, unnamed insiders suddenly exist everywhere. You know the type. Someone close to the situation, a source who requested anonymity due to fear of repercussions. These sources don't provide hard proof. They provide vibes. They provide mood. They provide whispers, suggesting meetings held that weren't announced, decisions made before investigations concluded, and priorities that seemed focused less on truth and more on containment. And yes, in this fictional retelling, the word containment comes up a lot, according to these imaginary sources. The biggest concern wasn't what happened, but how long the story would last, how quickly attention could be redirected, how fast grief could be canonized into legacy. Because once a narrative becomes a memorial, questioning it starts to look like sacrilege. And that, the story suggests, is incredibly convenient. The commentary character Candace leans into this angle hard. She talks not like a detective, but like a critic of systems. I'm not saying this, she's portrayed as saying. I'm asking why no one else is allowed to. And in the world of the script, that distinction matters. because the pushback she receives isn't factual correction. It's character attacks. People don't say she's wrong. They say she's dangerous, that she's disrespectful, that she's chasing attention, and here's where the dramatized outrage intensifies. Because in this version of events, legal language starts floating into the conversation early. Not lawsuits, not charges. Just reminders, quiet ones, carefully phrased ones. The kind of language that signals consequences without spelling them out. And to the audience inside this fictional world, that reads less like confidence and more like fear. Tenisha, in this narrative, is portrayed as furious not because lies were told, but because control was threatened. Control of the timeline, control of the emotional arc, control of what questions were considered acceptable. In fiction, fury doesn't always scream. Sometimes it coordinates. Sometimes it smiles in public and redirects in private. As weeks pass in this satirical storyline, more inconsistencies are noticed by online commentators. Not proven, just noticed. Why certain footage is referenced but never shown. Why timelines are summarized but never detailed. Why statements avoid specifics while insisting nothing is being hidden. To believers of the official narrative, these are normal choices. To skeptics, they're red flags. And to Candace's fictional audience, their content, she begins laying out what she calls narrative math, not evidence math if transparency is prioritized. Why does disclosure feel so selective? If truth is simple, why does it require so much explanation? If nothing is being concealed, why does every challenge trigger outrage instead of clarification? In response, this dramatized world depicts allies circling Tenisha tightly. Public statements emphasize unity. They praise her strength. They subtly frame critics as vultures. Not wrong, just tasteless. Not incorrect, just inappropriate. And in doing so, they shift the debate from facts to feelings. Where truth is harder to quantify, even the audience becomes part of the story. In comment sections imagined here, people split into camps. One side calling for respect, the other asking why respect always seems to flow in one direction. Why respecting the dead apparently requires silencing the living. What makes this fictional saga compelling isn't the accusations, it's the power dynamics. Who gets to speak? Who gets to question? Who decides when a conversation has run its course? And perhaps most importantly, who benefits when it ends? Candace, as written in this satirical narrative, frames herself not as a hero, but as a disruptor. Someone who ruins the clean endings. Someone who insists that unresolved questions don't disappear just because people are tired of them. And that insistence, according to the story, is exactly what enrages the gatekeepers of the narrative. By the time we reach the end of this first stretch of the story, the lines are drawn. On one side, a carefully maintained public image pushing forward, protecting legacy, guarding reputations. On the other, a commentator refusing closure without clarity. No rests, no revelations, just friction, just pressure, just a story that won't neatly wrap itself up. A story that won't neatly wrap itself up. And as this fictional narrative moves forward, the whispers grow louder. The anonymous sources begin contradicting one another. And the question shifts from what happened to something far more dangerous for those in charge. What happens next? When the audience stops accepting silence as an answer and starts demanding more. Which is exactly where this video begins. As this fictional narrative continues, the atmosphere grows thicker. Not because of new facts, but because of escalation. In this dramatized world, once a story refuses to die quietly, institutions don't panic all at once. First, they dismiss, then they deflect, and finally, they distract. And according to this parody-like account, the distraction phase arrives right on schedule. Suddenly, new side stories begin to flood the space. Unrelated headlines, emotional appeals, carefully timed tributes, a renewed focus on legacy, impact, and moving forward. None of it explicitly contradicts the questions being raised, but none of it answers them either. To some fictional observers, it feels like watching a magician wave one hand wildly while the other stays carefully hidden. In this story, Candace continues to push, but her approach shifts slightly. Less questioning, more framing. She begins laying out theoretical timelines, hypothetical scenarios, and if-then chains that stop just short of accusation. And it's here that the reaction changes tone. Because once a narrative starts forming in the public imagination, control becomes harder to maintain, according to imaginary insiders introduced at the stage. Closed-door conversations allegedly become more intense. Not about truth, but about damage, about perception management, about which voices matter and which can be drowned out with enough noise. Again, this remains fictional. No documents, no names. Just the suggestion that power rarely announces itself. It rearranges quietly. Publicly, Tenisha in this narrative doubles down on composure. Carefully chosen words emphasize peace, healing, and respect. No acknowledgement of specifics. No direct engagement with questions. And that restraint, ironically, becomes fuel. Because audiences trained on authenticity have learned to read silence as strategy. Online reactions in this fictional universe begin to fracture further. Some viewers accuse Candace of exploiting tragedy. Others praise her for refusing to be intimidated. Memes appear, parodies, reaction videos analyzing facial expressions, pauses in statements, even the absence of certain people at certain events. Logic stretches thin, but influence expands. Because virality doesn't require certainty. It requires curiosity. Then come the leaks. Not real ones. The kind that exist only in this dramatized space. Screen grabs without context. Audio clips that cut off too soon. Emails described but never shown. Every item carefully vague enough to be unprovable, but specific enough to feel real. Critics call it reckless. Supporters call it necessary pressure. In this version of events, what truly shifts the momentum is not Candace's content, but the reaction to it. Instead of rebuttals, there's outrage. Instead of clarification, there's condemnation. Instead of evidence, there's moral framing. And to a skeptical audience, that imbalance feels telling. Tenisha's inner circle, as portrayed here, allegedly begins positioning itself defensively. Not legally, but culturally. Allies speak louder. Critics are labeled. Lines are drawn. The story becomes less about what happened and more about who is allowed to ask. And once that happens, neutrality disappears. Financial whispers begin circulating in this fictional space as well. Again, nothing concrete, just questions. Why certain funds were redirected? Why financial transparency wasn't prioritized publicly? Why charitable messaging intensified at the exact moment scrutiny increased? Coincidence, according to defenders. Pattern, according to skeptics. Candace, in this scripted universe, frames it all as optics. I'm not saying anything illegal happened. She's imagined as saying. I'm saying the optics don't add up, and optics, in the court of public opinion, can be just as powerful as evidence. Sometimes more imaginary legal analysts appear on podcasts debating hypothetical outcomes. If this were investigated, if records were subpoenaed, if testimony conflicted, the words if and when do heavy lifting, creating a sense of inevitability without needing proof. The audience leans forward, waiting for the next shoe to drop, even if no shoe exists. Meanwhile, mainstream commentary in this narrative remains hesitant, discussing controversy vaguely without naming it, acknowledging online discourse without summarizing it. It's the kind of coverage designed to look balanced while saying very little. And that silence from major platforms gives alternative voices more oxygen. The emotional temperature rises. Supporters feel attacked. Skeptics feel validated. Neutral viewers feel confused. And confusion, historically, is fertile ground for distrust. Candace's fictional presence thrives there, asking questions faster than they can be dismissed, piling speculation onto silence until the absence of answers becomes the story itself. At this point in the script, Tenisha is portrayed not just as defensive, but reactive. Not publicly, strategically, the goal in this satirical telling isn't to prove Candace wrong, but to make her irrelevant. Label the conversation toxic. Frame disengagement as dignity. Starve the fire of oxygen by pretending it never mattered. But the problem with the internet is that pretending doesn't erase fingerprints. Anonymous defenders attack Candace's motives, her credibility, her past, anything but the substance of the questions. And to some viewers, that tactic rings familiar. Because when motive becomes the focus, substance often goes untouched, the narrative grows larger than any one person. It becomes about control versus curiosity, closure versus clarity, and whether silence should be trusted simply because it's delivered calmly. As this fictional chapter nears its end, the stakes subtly shift. The conversation moves from what happened to how far will this go, because once a story survives its first wave of dismissal, it usually either collapses or escalates. And in this dramatized universe, escalation feels inevitable. The audience senses it. The commentator leans into it. The institutions brace for it. And just as the pressure peaks, just as the idea of consequences begins to feel plausible rather than hypothetical, the story approaches its most dangerous phase, not revelation, but reaction. Because how power responds when it feels cornered often reveals more than the questions that cornered it in the first place. Which is exactly where the video begins. As this fictional narrative enters its final stretch, the tone doesn't explode all at once. It tightens. The room gets quieter. Because in stories like this, the loudest phase is rarely the most consequential. What matters now isn't what's being said publicly, but what's being anticipated privately. The sense that something irreversible has already shifted. In this dramatized universe, Candace Owens is no longer just a commentator stirring debate. She's framed, by both supporters and critics, as a stress test, not of facts, but of tolerance. How much questioning is acceptable before unity becomes fragile? How much ambiguity can exist before it threatens authority? And for those managing the image surrounding Malcolm-Jamal Warner's legacy in this fictional story, that question starts to feel dangerously close to home. Speculation ramps up about consequences. Not confirmed ones, not documented ones. Hypothetical futures, imaginary outcomes. Online analysts discuss what could happen if independent reviews were demanded, if financial transparency became unavoidable, if too many inconsistencies piled up to be brushed aside. The language is always conditional. Could, might, what if, but repetition gives those words weight. Tenisha Warner, depicted here as both protected and pressured, becomes the emotional center of the backlash. To supporters in this narrative, she is under attack, unfairly scrutinized during grief, targeted for refusing to engage with provocation. To critics, she represents institution-first thinking, the belief that stability matters more than clarity, that protecting a structure is more important than interrogating its foundations, and once again, nothing is proven, nothing is resolved, but perception hardens. Because perception doesn't need proof to spread. It needs only momentum. Imaginary scenarios circulate about closed investigations reopening, about independent committees, about watchdog groups expressing interest. Whether these things exist doesn't matter in the world of the script. What matters is that the idea of scrutiny feels closer than before. Not guaranteed, just closer. And that proximity changes behavior. Proximity changes behavior. Candace, as written in this final act, shifts into what she calls persistence. No longer digging, just refusing to stop observing. She reacts to reactions. She points out avoidance. She notes who speaks and who doesn't, and she emphasizes one theme relentlessly: silence is still communication. Meanwhile, the response on the other side grows more restrained, but more calculated. Fewer statements. Fewer appearances, a controlled narrowing of exposure, not retreat, just consolidation. In this fictional telling, it's the posture of people who believe time will solve what answers cannot. The legacy of Malcolm-Jamal Warner hangs over everything in this story like a sealed room you're not allowed to enter. Everyone claims to be protecting it. Everyone invokes it. And yet, no one agrees on what honoring it actually requires. Is it preserving an image untouched by controversy? Or is it allowing uncomfortable truth-seeking, even if it complicates the memory? That question fuels the final wave of public discourse in this narrative. And it's here that audiences begin questioning more than just the situation. They question the rules themselves. Who decides when a story is over? Who benefits from fatigue? Who loses when curiosity is framed as cruelty? The irony, as this fictional script presents it, is that no explosive reveal ever happens. No dramatic document drop. No smoking gun. Just an accumulation of unresolved tension. And sometimes that's worse. Because when nothing conclusively ends a story, it lingers. It resurfaces. It mutates. By now, critics accuse Candace of dragging things out deliberately. Supporters accuse Tenisha of running the clock. Neutral observers admit they no longer know what to believe, only that something feels unfinished. And that feeling alone is enough to keep engagement alive. Talk of legal action flickers at the edges of the conversation. Not filings, not courts, just warnings. The idea that lines exist, even if they aren't visible. And in this fictional world, those warnings do less to calm the discourse than they do to confirm suspicions that pressure is being applied somewhere out of view. As attention begins to drift, as all online storms eventually do, the story doesn't end so much as it recedes. But it recedes unevenly. Certain clips continue circulating. Certain questions remain unanswered. And every time Malcolm-Jamal Warner's name trends for unrelated reasons in this narrative, the old debate reignites beneath the surface. That's the lasting impact in this dramatized conclusion. Not resolution, but residue. A sense that something was contested and never settled. That truth, whatever it is, remains fragmented across perspectives, each claiming moral high ground. Candace Owens, in this final portrayal, doesn't claim victory. She claims endurance. The questions still stand. She's imagined to say. And Tenisha Warner, in this ending, doesn't concede or collapse. She maintains course, betting that time, not transparency, will solidify her position and the audience. The audience is left exactly where modern narratives often leave them, in between unsure, tired, but curious, skeptical, but emotionally invested, wondering whether the story mattered because of what was revealed or because of what never was done. So in this fictional universe, there is no final answer, no definitive truth exposed. Just the lingering discomfort of unresolved questions and the realization that power doesn't always hide behind lies. Sometimes it hides behind calm, behind patience, behind the assumption that silence will eventually be mistaken for innocence. And as the screen fades on this chapter, one idea remains suspended in the air. Refusing closure, if truth really has nothing to fear, why does it so often arrive last? After everyone else has already decided what they're willing to accept. And now it's over to you, because stories like this don't actually end when the video ends. They end when people stop asking questions, or maybe when they start asking better ones. In this fictional narrative, nothing was proven, nothing was settled, and yet everything was exposed in a different way. Not facts, not evidence, but the machinery of how stories are shaped, managed, and sometimes quietly redirected. So ask yourself this: if everything was truly clear, why does it still feel unfinished? If there was nothing to hide, why did so much energy go into controlling the conversation instead of answering it? And if questioning power is wrong, then who benefits most from that rule? Maybe Candace Owens is wrong in this story. Maybe Tenisha Warner is misunderstood. Maybe the legacy of Malcolm-Jamal Warner deserves protection above all else. Or maybe the truth usually lives somewhere uncomfortable between certainty and silence. That's where you come in. Drop your thoughts below. Not attacks, not blind loyalty, just clarity. What stood out to you? What felt off? What felt overblown? Do you think questioning narratives is necessary, or does it cross a line? If you want more breakdowns like this, where nothing is taken at face value and silence is treated as part of the story, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because if this fictional world has taught us anything, it's that the stories we're told matter just as much as the ones we're never encouraged to finish thinking about.